In this session, we're going to talk about reading the Gospel of Matthew. Each of the four Gospels have their own signature or their own thumbprint about them, and that in part is why we have the four. All of them obviously are focused on the ministry of Jesus, all of them looking at that through a particular lens and for a particular audience. So in this session, let's focus on Matthew itself, the very first gospel. The primary reason why Matthew is placed as the first gospel among the four is most definitely because it is, of the four gospels, the one that kind of displays and reveals a number of Jewish features about it. It is the gospel that most naturally bridges the ongoing story of what God has been doing in Israel through the prophets, and it is the way that that story kind of finds fulfillment in Christ. So let me just share with you some of those Jewish features that are predominant in the Gospel of Matthew, so that as you are reading through that particular gospel, you'll be able to take note of them, see where they appear, and understand them in the larger context that they are intended to help primarily Jewish readers make the connection between the Jesus story and the story of what God has been doing leading up to the Jesus story. The Gospel of Matthew starts with a genealogy, and the verse that actually kind of introduces the genealogy is itself in the Greek language an interesting verse. If it could be transliterated, it would be something like this in English: the genesis of the Bible, or the genesis of the origin of Jesus Christ. So the very opening words are filled with a beautiful way of helping us to see that this is a new beginning, yet a beginning that is connected with the story that has gone before it. And there's a hint of the fact that this story is a new moment of origin, and God is acting in this. So the first verse simply reads, "This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham." In this opening verse, Matthew squarely puts the Jesus story in the same breath, in the same context as the significance of the stories of David and Abraham. And you could certainly imagine that if you are seeking to address a Jewish audience, if you're seeking to proclaim the message that Jesus is in fact the Messiah that God has sent, that it would be very, very helpful and quite essential to see the ongoing story of what God has been doing all the way since Abraham, a hero of the faith, through David, another heroic figure, and now in Jesus. So it's very intentional that Matthew would place these three individuals, these three names, in the same verse. It's very interesting that in the first verse, he starts with Jesus, goes back to David, goes back to Abraham, but in the subsequent genealogy, he reverses that order. In other words, he starts with Abraham, and then he begins to fill that genealogy out. And he does so, and he follows it from Abraham, and there'll be a lot of names that, for most of us will appear to be names that we perhaps don't fully recognize. But what is clear in the genealogy is that there is there's an intentional progression, starting with Abraham, the father of the faith, going through David, and then finding its way ultimately in fulfillment in Jesus. And it is also clear that Matthew has placed this genealogy in a framework that kind of divides the storyline out in a clear way. At the end of it, he actually says there were 14 generations in all from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the exile in Babylon, and 14 from the exile to the Messiah. So you clearly see that Matthew has put the genealogy in a framework that is very Jewish oriented. It features heroes of the faith. It places the story of Israel in a very kind of tight and compact kind of outline. Each of them have 14 generations, and it moves from Abraham to David to the exile to Jesus. 4 very significant and important moments in the life of Israel. So the genealogy itself reveals its very Jewish kind of makeup and the Jewish approach to putting Jesus into a story that Matthew takes all the way back to Abraham himself. Another feature of this genealogy is one that is just quite interesting. It is, as in the cultural mode of the day, a genealogy that is male in orientation. Yet in this genealogy, Matthew, somewhat surprisingly, inserts the names of several females, several women along the way. So I'll just tell you who those particular women are, and in a moment it will be a beautiful way for us to see how Matthew is setting up the story that he wants to share with us. There is the name of Tamar that appears in the genealogy. There is Rahab. There is Ruth. There is, as Matthew will write it, the wife of Uriah, whom we all know to be Bathsheba, but he just says the wife of Uriah, doesn't use her name. And in a moment we'll see how he draws a finale to all that. So let's just take the first 4 of these 5 names: Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, the wife of Uriah. What each of these have in common is this. In each of their own stories, there is some hint or some suggestion or some possible sense that there is some sexual immorality affiliated with it. And when you go back and look at their stories, each of them have their own twists in ways in which human sexuality plays a significant part of the story. So no matter how you do this, it's not that they all share exactly the same story, it's that in each of them there is something of a cloud of suspicion that is cast. And some of them are just outright Rahab, a prostitute. And so Matthew draws on these particular women, these 4 stories, to set up what he's going to do right after the genealogy. And that is, he's going to enter into the birth narrative. Obviously, the birth narrative feature parents of Jesus, Joseph and Mary. And at the end of Matthew's genealogy, having laid the groundwork by mentioning the four that we have just briefly discussed. He then mentions and reveals to us the name of Mary. Once you put all of them together, now you see the five of them, Mary included as the fifth with the four that we've talked about. You could perhaps see that the primary purpose, most likely, for the mention of these select women is, in fact, to set up or to prepare the way for accepting or hearing the story of Mary. And so Jewish readers very familiar with the stories of the four women, now they're going to be presented with a story about Mary. The thing that holds the story of Mary together with the previous four women who are mentioned is that she also, as her story unfolds, is also under some cloud of suspicion. The fact that she is pregnant and her marriage had not been consummated with Joseph yet. So Matthew, in a really brilliant move, places Mary's name at the end of the genealogy and has drawn out four prior names in a way to set up Mary's own story that God used, regardless of their particular circumstances. God's mission flowed through these women. And now we come to Mary, and she will have her suspicions about her and her relationship with Joseph or somebody else, and yet against all suspicion that might be cast against any of these, and now especially and particularly Mary, it is clear that God's mission is going to flow through Mary. So it is an incredible genealogy, very Jewish in its orientation. It is the perfect bridge, although for those of us who are non-Jewish in our understanding and in our orientation, in our perspective of Scripture, from a Jewish perspective, there just could not have been a more appropriate, a better way to begin to tell the Jesus story than to tell it in the form of the kind of genealogy that Matthew presents to us at the very beginning of his gospel. Another Jewish feature is the birth narrative itself. You'll see the birth narrative in the Gospel of Matthew. There will be the birth narrative, obviously, in the Gospel of Luke. And what is unique about the birth narrative in the Gospel of Matthew is, again, it's Jewish flavor. In this particular telling of the birth narrative, the focus is on Joseph, again on the patriarchal, the male side of the story, that which was mostly accepted in the culture of that day. And although we all know that Mary plays clearly a significant and essential role in that, the visits of the angels in Matthew's telling of the birth narrative are to Joseph. And the birth story itself focuses on the journey and the pilgrimage that Joseph had in God bringing him to this entire story. And so you'll see in this narrative yet another very Jewish kind of presentation of the birth narrative. And through this, beginning of this narrative, you'll also see a phrase that begins to appear frequently throughout the Gospel of Matthew, and it is the phrase, or what we would call the fulfillment sayings. These things were done to fulfill this. And whenever, wherever you're reading in Matthew and you see that phrase, that simple phrase is a way for particularly a Jewish reader to be able to resonate with that which had been done previously, that which God had said, or that which a prophet had said, or God said through a prophet. It is a way to make a connection to what God has previously done. So Matthew is very adept at telling the story of Jesus and using the phrase something like, this was done to fulfill this, in an attempt to help his readers to make all of the connections that they possibly could between the Jesus story and the story of all that had preceded that, and what from Protestant perspective we would call the Old Testament. So you'll see a number of the fulfillment stories. You'll also see in the birth narrative and even beyond a theme of righteousness. Obviously, this is going to be a very signature kind of Jewish theme, and you'll see this theme of righteousness as it is initially applied to Joseph, that he is a righteous man, and you can follow this particular theme throughout the Gospel of Matthew. And in just a moment, we'll talk about a particular place in Matthew's Gospel where this theme seems to be very predominant and very clear in its presentation. You'll also encounter in the Gospel of Matthew parallel stories between what happens with or to Jesus and what has happened to Israel or to Moses. So in the Matthew story, after the birth story is told, we're told about King Herod. And when King Herod is ultimately made aware, the Magi have come and they have found Jesus, and as a result of all of that, King Herod has ultimately heard about the birth of Jesus. An angel appears to Joseph, and Joseph, Mary, and Jesus escape to Egypt. And here you can see parallels to the nation of Israel, or the children of Israel, in their own journey into Egypt. And after some time, an angel of the Lord appears to Joseph again and tells him that it is time for his family to move back, and they move to Nazareth and make their home there. But you can clearly see that this going into Egypt and this coming out of Egypt theme is not just about something that happened to Israel. This is something that happens in the Jesus story. And it would be hard to draw a closer connection or parallel between the Jesus story and the story of Israel than this theme of going down and being brought out of Egypt. There is also, and closely connected with that, some would see a number of parallels between Moses and Jesus. And there certainly are some places in which Jesus makes a reference to Moses, or as we'll see in just a moment, perhaps the way that the entire gospel is intentionally laid out is a way that reflects Moses and his own writings, And it is clear that Jesus refers to Moses. He compares himself to Moses. He honors Moses, and yet Jesus is greater than Moses. So there will be a number of places in which, throughout the Gospel of Matthew, you will see Moses appear, you'll hear echoes, you'll see a reference, or you'll have a sense of something resonating perhaps within you, that this is a reflection of, or this is a tie back to Moses himself. Another theme, or a phrasing actually, that you will see in the Gospel of Matthew, which is a way of honoring the language of the Jews, is Matthew's and his unique use of the kingdom of heaven, where in all other places we would hear the kingdom of God, and the other Gospels or in Paul's writings or elsewhere. In Matthew specifically, Matthew being very aware of the Jewish reserve to not say the name of God, in a way gets to the same thing that Jesus is saying, the kingdom. But he does so by circumventing the Jewish, or honoring the Jewish reluctance to say the name of God, and he circumvents that in such a way as to cast it in terms of the kingdom of heaven. So that's a nice little package of seeing the primary Jewish features that you're going to encounter as you are reading through the Gospel of Matthew. Let's take a moment and just talk about the structure of the Gospel itself. I don't think anyone would say that of any of the four Gospels that they were just randomly thrown together. It is clear that each of the Gospels and each of the Gospel writers had a clear intention about the way that they were going to tell the story of Jesus. And in Matthew's case, you probably have some of the most clearest markers in the text itself, in the story itself, of how Matthew is putting together the story of Jesus. So let me just kind of broadly let you know how this works in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew apparently has 5 themes. There are 5 big segments in the Gospel of Matthew that follow one right after the other. Each of those segments, or each of those frames, include 2 parts. So in any of those frames, there will be a narrative section, and those are stories that Matthew gives us about Jesus that are going to be consistent with the particular larger theme that Matthew is working on in that particular segment. So in the segment, in each of the 5 segments, there will be a portion that is narrative, the actions of Jesus, the things that Jesus did, the deeds of Jesus. That will be immediately followed in that frame, or within that section, by what is typically called a discourse section. That would mean the things that Jesus said, the Jesus sayings. So if you can imagine or picture 5 huge frames set side by side, and each of them have a particular topic, and each of them, or within each of those frames, there is a narrative section and there is a discourse section. You could probably begin to see how Matthew, with a great deal of intention and attention, tells the story of Jesus. I know that it would be tempting to say, somebody who is probably highly imaginative, made this scheme up and just made the grid and kind of forced it onto Matthew's story. There might be a hint of truth in that if it were not for this, or these several things. One is you can clearly see the themes in each of those frames, but even more so, Matthew himself pretty much gives away these huge sections, these frames of 5, because at the end of each frame, there is something that he writes that is very similar and would undoubtedly be a marker or something that Matthew did with high intention that allows us to see that Matthew has completed this particular frame or this particular section. And the frame or the saying at the end of the frame, there'll be something like this one. For instance, after the first frame, and I'll tell you what they are by chapter in just a moment, Matthew writes, when Jesus had finished these sayings. At the end of the second frame, Matthew writes, after Jesus had finished instructing his disciples. And this goes on for each of those 5 frames. So this is not just an imaginative type way to outline or sketch out the Gospel of Matthew. This is clearly the way that Matthew himself revealed to us or indicated to us that he has treated this particular topic and he's brought it to a close, and he's ready to begin the very next section. So let's take those 5 sections. I'll just simply give you the basic theme of each of those 5 sections, and we'll see how all of that kind of comes together in the Gospel of Matthew. As you know, as we've alluded to earlier in this session, the story of Matthew, Gospel of Matthew, begins with the genealogy and the birth account of Jesus, and all of that happens within the first 2 chapters. So chapters 1 and 2, in this larger picture of the 5 frames of Matthew, are kind of a introductory prologue to the ministry of Jesus, certainly essential and obviously very, very much significant to what is to come. After that, we see the 5 frames, each of them with a narrative and discourse. The first frame has to do with the topic of the righteousness of the kingdom of God. And interestingly, the thing that each of these 5 frames will have in common will be some aspect of the kingdom, I should say, from Matthew's perspective, the kingdom of heaven. And so the first one is the righteousness of the kingdom. So that's frame number 1. Within that frame, there is narrative, things that show what righteousness looks like, and that would be chapters 3 and 4, deeds of Jesus, or things that Jesus participated in, things like baptism and temptation, and how his righteousness is revealed in those particular kinds of activities. And then there is discourse, things that Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. That would be chapters 5 through 7. So, frame 1 in the Gospel of Matthew is the righteousness of the kingdom. Within that frame are the narratives of chapters 3 and 4 and the discourse of chapters 5 through 7. Chapters 5 through 7 happen to be the famous sayings of what is popularly called the Sermon on the Mount. And that message, or those sayings of Jesus, or that sermon of Jesus, focuses on the righteousness of living in the kingdom of heaven. This Sermon on the Mount really is kind of an entree into what life in the kingdom looks like, and to the attitudes of the heart, to the actions of those who live in the kingdom. This is the sermon, just to refresh your memory, that begins with what are typically called the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so off Matthew goes. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and so forth. So in this sermon, or in this message, it becomes clear that the kingdom is going to be, in many ways, counterintuitive to the kind of righteousness that the religious establishment people up in that particular time had as their vision. This is also the sermon in which Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will in no way enter into heaven. That would be an intimidating kind of thing for any person to say, wow, yeah, it's not that Jesus is saying the scribes and Pharisees did not have righteousness. It was that they had a religious kind of righteousness, and Jesus kind of set what righteousness in the kingdom looks like, what righteousness in the kingdom thinks like, how righteousness in the kingdom acts. He set all of that against the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, and he pointed out the stark differences between those two kinds of righteousnesses. So the first frame focuses on righteousness in the kingdom. The second frame focuses on the mission of the kingdom. And this frame, like all of them, will have a narrative and discourse. The narrative portion of this frame is chapters 8 and 9, and the discourse, the things that Jesus said, are chapter 10. So the second frame consists of chapters 8 through 10, narrative, discourse. The theme is going to be the mission of the kingdom. And this is where we are going to see Matthew give us some beautiful insights into the mission of Jesus by the way he acts with people, with outsiders, with nature, and with his disciples. And then there is the great discourse in which Jesus, in chapter 10, sends his disciples out, sends out the 12. The third frame is the parables of the kingdom. The parables of Jesus are construct stories that Jesus tells in order to bring great insight, or to reveal even the presence of the kingdom of heaven. And in order to do that, oftentimes Jesus, he can use a simple illustration, he can tell a story, but however he does it, usually has an incredible, profound impact. And in many of the stories that he tells concerning the kingdom, the impact is such that you could not see this coming, or you were caught off guard, or you were blindsided. And in that moment, what the kingdom of heaven looks like becomes more clear to us, or we have a fresh experience of that. So in the third section, chapters 11 and 12 are the narrative. We often don't talk about parables in terms of narratives or stories, but these are stories in which we see kingdom-type revelations. And then in chapter 13, Matthew has taken a number of Jesus' parables and placed them all together in one place, and just kind of moved through them. So it's clearly an intention of Matthew to take the parables of Jesus and, as he's writing, just to place them in one place and to create a particular frame or section in which the focus is on parables that reveal the kingdom to us. The next section, frame 4, consists of chapters 14 through 18. And it is within this particular frame that, of all things, the word church, ecclesia, is used. The only two times used in the Gospels falls within this section. And this section's theme has to do with the kingdom. And we could say the church or the gathering or the community, but more appropriately, it would be the kingdom and the new Israel. And as we've talked about, there are certainly connections between Israel and then the new community that begins with Jesus as he calls the 12 to him, and a lot of parallels between Jesus and Moses and between the community that he creates as being something of a new Israel. So in this section, in this particular frame, we get a sense of what this new Israel is about. And chapters 14 through 17 would be the narrative or the stories that give insight into the new Israel. And chapter 18 would be the discourse, what Jesus said. The fifth and final frame has to do with what we would popularly call eschatology or the end times. And in this final frame, the theme has to do with the kingdom and the end. And so there will be some very lengthy Jesus sayings in this, and this frame, like all the others, has the two parts of the narrative and the discourse. The narrative is chapters 19 through 22, and the discourse will be chapters 23 through 25. So you can put all of that together, lay them side by side, and you can kind of just flow through the Gospel of Matthew by using what Matthew gives to us as kind of signatures along the way of how to read his Gospel and what themes he is bringing together in each of the sections. Now, as you might recognize, chapter 25 is not the end of the Gospel of Matthew. There are chapters 26, 27, 28. These chapters are very much like chapters 1 and 2. These are in a sense, the dramatic climax of the Gospel. This is where Jesus is betrayed. These are the chapters which tell the story of his trial, of his crucifixion, of his resurrection. So the final three chapters are the climax of this Jesus story, and all of those frames before it kind of set up and led us to this story of Jesus. Very interesting that even in the stories of things like betrayal, trial, crucifixion, as you're reading through them, you could probably identify some Jewish features. In other words, the various gospel writers might tell different aspects of the trial, or they might present the crucifixion in a particular way. And yet, in Matthew's gospel particularly, there are some really rich kind of Jewish connections. One that kind of stood out to me as I was just looking again at the crucifixion story was that we know, if you took all of the Gospels, that there were several things that Jesus said in his final moments. And none of the Gospels gives us all of them, but the one that Matthew chose to write was, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when you begin to reflect on that particular saying and the importance of the presence of God, going all the way back in the early Old Testament, and how God demonstrated that presence on a mountain, in a tent, a tabernacle, ultimately in a temple, now through Christ, how essential it is for humanity to experience the presence of God. I mean, even going back to creation in the Garden of Eden, the pristine moment of the uninterrupted presence of God with Adam and Eve. And now here is the Messiah on a cross, and his words could not be any more darkly dramatic. Words like, "The very God who has been with us all this time, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And then, of course, the story of the resurrection. This is also the gospel that you are probably quite aware, that ends with what we typically call the Great Commission. And I know that we tend to emphasize the mission nature of that Great Commission, which is certainly appropriate. It's also interesting to note that before Jesus said anything about going into the world and making disciples, which is the imperative, the making the disciples was the imperative of the Great Commission, he said, "All authority in heaven and earth is given to me." And you might be able to see here again some connection to the story of God in what we would call the Old Testament, and now in this moment of resurrection and the triumph of Jesus, he is the one who declares that heaven and earth's full authority has been given to him. So I hope that you will find a more meaningful way to approach and to look and experience the story of Jesus when you read that story in the Gospel of Matthew.